The storm was brutal. Ethan's hands trembled on the wheel as his dog barked at something unseen. Through the blizzard, a pregnant woman collapsed, and one Marine made the choice that saved them both. That night, faith, courage, and a loyal dog turned a frozen road into a path toward God's miracle. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe for more stories. Snow fell like shattered glass across the empty streets of Denver, swirling in ghostly spirals that blurred the world into shades of white and silence. Inside an old green pickup truck, the heater groaned against the cold, its hum barely louder than the wind that howled through the narrow avenues. Ethan Cole gripped the steering wheel, eyes fixed on the dim stretch of road ahead. He was 30, though the years behind his eyes carried the weight of 50. His face was angular, with a rough jawline half shaded by stubble and a faint scar cutting across his right cheek, a relic from a night raid in Helmand that he rarely spoke of. His dark hair was cropped short, military style, more out of habit than vanity. The kind of man who measured life not in days, but in missions completed. Beside him sat Ranger, his German shepherd, now 7 years old, a broad-shouldered dog with a sable coat that shimmered under the dashboard light. His amber eyes were alert, scanning the world outside the fogged window. Ranger had been trained for search and rescue, but years in Afghanistan had turned him into something beyond discipline. He was a partner, a conscience wrapped in fur. Ethan sometimes thought Ranger sensed danger before it existed, as though he carried fragments of the world's pain in his nose and bones. The storm was worsening. Snow thickened, falling faster, turning streetlights into blurred halos. Ethan's wipers scraped back and forth, barely keeping up. He checked his watch, 7:48 p.m. He was late for his interview at a private security firm on the north side. A good job, steady pay, health insurance, the kind of things his old self would have laughed at. But now, after years of battle and a slow drift into civilian life, he needed something to tether him. The Marines had given him purpose. Civility, however, had given him insomnia. Ranger lifted his head suddenly, ears pricking toward the right. He let out a low growl, the kind that came from instinct, not irritation. Ethan frowned. "What is it, boy?" Then came the bark, sharp, urgent, slicing through the muffled storm. Ranger pawed at the window, whining, then barked again, louder this time. Ethan followed his gaze. Through the snowfall, faint and ghostly in the glow of a flickering street lamp, he saw her. A woman sat on a frozen bench at a deserted bus stop. She was slumped forward, one hand gripping the edge of the seat, the other pressed tightly against her belly. Her coat, thin, once beige but now soaked to gray, clung to her frail frame. Her hair, a tangled chestnut brown, whipped around her face in the wind. She looked young, perhaps 28 or 29, but exhaustion had carved shadows under her eyes. Her lips trembled as she gasped for air, each breath leaving small clouds in the icy air. Ethan slowed the truck. For a heartbeat, he considered driving on. The logical part of him, the soldier trained to focus on the mission, told him he had a destination. He had an interview. He had to rebuild. But another voice, older, deeper, whispered a phrase that had been branded into him since his first deployment. No one gets left behind. Ranger barked again, pawing the door impatiently. Ethan sighed. All right. We're stopping." He pulled the truck to the curb and turned off the engine. The silence was immense, broken only by the wind and Ranger's anxious breath. As Ethan stepped out, the cold hit him like a wall. He zipped up his jacket, his boots crunching through the snow as he approached the woman. "Ma'am, you all right?" he called out, his voice steady, low. The woman tried to look up, but her face contorted with pain. "Please, I can't. My baby!" Her words broke into gasps. Ethan saw then the curve of her belly, large and tense beneath her soaked coat. She was pregnant, near the end of term, and clearly in distress. He crouched beside her. "I'm Ethan. I can get you to a hospital. Can you stand?" She shook her head weakly. "No buses. I waited too long." Her voice cracked, her fingers white from gripping her stomach. "I can't afford—" "Don't worry about that," Ethan said, glancing back at Ranger, who stood beside him, tail still but eyes blazing with focus. "You're not alone." Her eyes met his, filled with disbelief and something else. Shame, maybe fear. "Why are you helping me?" she whispered. "Because someone has to." He slid one arm behind her shoulders, another under her knees, lifting her effortlessly. She was lighter than she looked, her body trembling against his chest. "We'll get you there," he murmured. As he carried her toward the truck, Ranger ran ahead, circling once before jumping into the back seat. Ethan opened the passenger door carefully, easing her in. The woman winced, clutching her belly. "My name, Sarah," she breathed. "Sarah Miller." Ethan nodded, fastening the seatbelt across her lap. "Hang on, Sarah. You're safe now." He turned the ignition, tires spinning before catching traction. Ranger sat between the seats, eyes locked on Sarah, his ears twitching at every groan that escaped her. The storm outside roared, but inside the cab, there was only the sound of labored breathing and the rhythmic hum of the engine. Ethan's mind raced as he drove. He thought of the times he had carried wounded comrades through dust storms far deadlier than this. The same pounding heart, the same weight of a life in his hands. Only now, there was no uniform, no orders, just instinct. Sarah cried out, gripping his arm. "It's coming. The baby's coming." Ethan gritted his teeth. "Just hold on. We're close." He pressed harder on the gas, the truck fishtailing slightly as it hit a patch of ice. Ranger barked sharply, steadying him, as if commanding, "Focus, Marine." The red neon sign of Denver Memorial Hospital flickered through the snow like a lighthouse. Ethan exhaled shakily. Almost there. He skidded into the emergency lane, jumped out, and shouted for help. Two nurses rushed forward with a stretcher. "Pregnant woman, severe contractions," he said quickly. "She needs help now." They lifted Sarah gently. As they wheeled her inside, she reached for Ethan's hand. "Don't leave me," she whispered, tears freezing on her lashes. He squeezed her fingers. "You're not alone anymore." Ranger stood beside him, chest rising and falling in short bursts of steam. His fur was white with snow, but his eyes burned like amber flame. Inside the hospital, the automatic doors slid shut behind them, sealing off the storm. Ethan glanced at Ranger and gave a faint smile. "Guess we're late for that interview." Ranger wagged his tail once, as if saying it was worth it. And for the first time in months, Ethan felt something crack open inside him, the cold, heavy shell he'd carried since the war, melting just a little under the warmth of a stranger's trust. Snow swirled around the hospital parking lot like restless spirits, and the glass doors slid open with a hiss as Ethan Cole carried Sarah Miller inside. The fluorescent light stung his eyes after the darkness of the storm. His arms ached from her weight, but he refused to set her down until a nurse ran toward him. A young woman in her late 20s named Lydia Hart, with short blonde hair tucked under a blue cap. Her cheeks were flushed from rushing between patients, and her tone was brisk but kind. "Emergency? How far along is she?" Ethan's voice was rough from the cold. "She's in active labor, maybe minutes away." Lydia's eyes widened slightly. "Room 3, now!" She grabbed a gurney while another orderly, a tall man with tired eyes and a fading tattoo on his forearm, helped him lift Sarah. "We'll take her from here, sir." Ethan hesitated for a fraction of a second, his hand still holding Sarah's trembling fingers. Her skin was pale and cold, her lips trembling with pain. "Don't leave," she whispered. "Please, not yet." Ethan gave a single nod. "I'm not going anywhere." The gurney rolled down the hall. Ranger trotted beside Ethan, his paws clicking softly on the tile floor, nose twitching as he followed the scent of antiseptic and fear. A security guard approached, a broad man with a mustache and a skeptical look. "Sir, dogs aren't allowed in." Ethan flashed the old military ID he still carried, his tone sharp but steady. "Service dog. He stays." The guard studied Ranger's rigid stance, the trained focus in his eyes, then stepped aside without another word. They stopped outside the delivery room. Ethan watched through the small glass window as nurses surrounded Sarah. Her hair clung to her forehead, dark with sweat, her breaths sharp and shallow. Lydia adjusted the monitors and murmured something that made Sarah nod weakly. Ethan's pulse raced in rhythm with the monitors beeping. He'd seen men bleed out in deserts and jungles, but this quiet human struggle for life, was somehow heavier. He caught his reflection in the glass, a soldier without a war, trying to save someone he'd met less than an hour ago. A man in a white coat appeared beside him. "You brought her in." The newcomer had graying hair, a neatly trimmed beard, and a voice deep as gravel. His name tag read, Dr. Paul Henderson, head of obstetrics. Henderson was in his late 50s, tall and composed, the kind of man whose calm came from decades of chaos. "You did the right thing," he said quietly. "But she's weak, dehydrated, and her blood pressure's low. We'll do our best." Ethan nodded. "Do whatever it takes." Henderson gave him a long look, one veteran recognizing another kind of soldier, then disappeared into the room. Minutes dragged like hours. Ethan sat on a plastic chair, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. Ranger lay beside him, head resting on his paws. Every so often, the dog would lift his head, ears twitching toward the muffled sounds behind the door. The hallway smelled faintly of disinfectant and burnt coffee. A janitor pushed a mop bucket past, humming an old country tune. Ethan's mind drifted, not to war, but to the silence that came after it. He remembered the first night home, lying awake in his empty apartment, hearing phantom gunfire and the hum of the refrigerator. He'd joined the Marines to fight for something good, but when the fighting stopped, no one had told him what to do with the ghosts. The door opened. Lydia stepped out, her face slick with sweat. "She's asking for you." Ethan rose immediately. "Is she?" "She's holding on, but she's scared." Inside, Sarah lay pale against the white sheets, her hair fanned across the pillow. Her eyes fluttered open when she heard him. "You came back," she breathed. Ethan moved closer, his hand finding hers. "Told you I would." Ranger stayed at the threshold, sitting alert, watching every move. Sarah looked at the dog and smiled faintly through the pain. "He hasn't taken his eyes off me." Ethan brushed a damp strand of hair from her forehead. "He's good at protecting people." A contraction racked her body. She squeezed his hand with surprising strength. "It hurts." Ethan leaned closer. "I know, Breathe with me. In. Out. That's it. He guided her rhythm, steady, patient, his own breath syncing with hers. It reminded him of calming a soldier panicking under fire. The same trembling, the same desperate need for reassurance that they weren't alone. The room filled with motion. Lydia adjusting instruments, Dr. Henderson issuing quiet orders, a beeping monitor keeping time with Sarah's heartbeat. The snow outside battered the window like fists of wind, and the lights flickered once, briefly dimming before holding steady again. Henderson looked up. Power's unstable, but we'll make do. She's close. Sarah's face twisted in pain. Please tell me it's almost over. Henderson nodded. One more push. You're stronger than you think. Ethan's grip tightened around her hand. He whispered, You've got this, Sarah. You're not alone. Ranger let out a low whine, sensing the crescendo, his eyes locked on her face. And then, a cry. Thin, piercing, alive. The tension in the room snapped like a string. Lydia smiled, lifting the newborn gently. A boy, she said softly. You've got a healthy baby boy. Sarah's tears mixed with sweat as she reached weakly for the child. Henderson nodded to Ethan. You can come closer. Ethan stepped forward, his throat tightening. The baby's skin was red and wrinkled, his tiny fingers curling in the cold air. Sarah held him, trembling, whispering something only the baby could hear. Ethan stood beside her, speechless. Ranger crept closer, sniffing once, then sat still, his gaze solemn as if he understood the miracle before him. Sarah looked up at Ethan. You saved us. Her voice cracked, fragile but filled with truth. Ethan shook his head slowly. No, ma'am. You did that yourself. A faint smile touched her lips. Then thank your friend. She reached out, fingers brushing Ranger's muzzle. He knew before anyone. Ranger wagged his tail once and laid his head on the edge of her bed. Outside, the storm began to ease, snow falling slower, gentler. Inside, the room was warm with the hum of new life. Henderson clapped Ethan lightly on the shoulder. You did good, son. The words hit deeper than they should have. No one had called him that in years. Ethan stepped back, letting Sarah rest. For the first time since returning from the war, the noise inside his mind went quiet. He looked at Ranger, who watched him with steady, knowing eyes. Let's stay a while, Ethan murmured. Ranger blinked once, as if in agreement. The night that had begun with loneliness ended in the fragile heartbeat of a newborn child, and Ethan Cole, for reasons he couldn't explain, felt like the world had just handed him a second chance. Morning crept into Denver beneath a sky of pale gray, the kind of light that makes everything look softer yet colder. The storm had quieted overnight, leaving the streets glazed with ice and roofs draped in white. Inside the small hospital room, the rhythm of life felt almost sacred. The steady beeping of monitors, the hushed voices of nurses passing by, and the faint sound of a newborn stirring. Ethan Cole sat in the chair beside Sarah Miller's bed, his eyes rimmed red from fatigue but softened by something gentler than sleep. Sarah was awake, though weak. The early light touched her face, pale and freckled. Her brown hair fanned across the pillow in disarray. Her once worried features were calmer now, exhaustion mixed with awe as she cradled her baby boy against her chest. The child's tiny fingers curled around hers with instinctive trust. She looked at Ethan, her voice barely above a whisper. He's so small. I didn't think he'd make it. Ethan smiled faintly, his voice rough. He's tougher than he looks. Takes after his mom. Ranger, lying by the bed, lifted his head at the sound of Sarah's voice. His fur had dried overnight, soft again, and his eyes gleamed like amber beneath the light. The dog had refused to leave the room, curling up near the heater, keeping quiet watch. Sarah reached out with her free hand, her thin fingers brushing his head. "He stayed here all night, didn't he?" Ethan nodded, didn't even blink. A soft knock came at the door, and Nurse Lydia Hart entered, carrying a clipboard. She looked fresher than last night, though her eyes still showed the fatigue of long shifts. "Good morning," she said with a smile that felt practiced but sincere. "How are we feeling today?" Sarah smiled weakly. "Like I got hit by a truck, but happy." Lydia chuckled, adjusting the baby's blanket. "That's a good sign." She turned to Ethan. "You stayed all night?" He shrugged. "Didn't seem right to leave." Lydia's eyes softened for a moment. "Not many would have done what you did. I hope you know that." Ethan didn't respond. Compliments made him uneasy. They reminded him of medals he never wore, of men who didn't live to receive theirs. He looked out the window, where the snow still fell in faint flurries. "I just did what needed doing." Moments later, Dr. Paul Henderson entered, his white coat crisp despite the long night. His gray beard glinted slightly under the fluorescent lights. "Good morning, Miss Miller," he said warmly. "And you, Mr. Cole. Our patient and her son are stable. You got her here just in time." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you, doctor." Henderson smiled, but the lines around his eyes betrayed years of seeing too much. Life beginning and ending under the same roof. "You're the one who did the hard work, young lady. You and your guardian angels." He nodded toward Ethan and Ranger. As the doctor checked vitals, Sarah's gaze drifted back to Ethan. "You never said what you do now." Ethan hesitated, the question tugging at the space inside him he rarely opened. "Used to be a Marine, worked with K-9 units, now just trying to find a place that needs a pair of steady hands." Sarah studied him for a moment. His posture was still that of a soldier, straight, alert, but his eyes carried the loneliness of someone who'd lived too long without purpose. "Seems to me," she said softly, "you already found one." Ranger stirred, standing and walking toward the window. His ears twitched, sensing movement outside. A nurse wheeling supplies, a janitor scraping ice off the steps. He turned back, watching Ethan with that quiet understanding dogs are born with. Ethan reached down to scratch behind his ears. "You did good, buddy." By afternoon, the room was warm and filled with quiet life. Sarah's baby slept peacefully in her arms. A social worker named Marion Ellis, a middle-aged woman with silver hair and kind eyes behind round glasses, entered carrying a folder. Her tone was polite but businesslike. "Miss Miller, I'm here to discuss your discharge options and financial support." She offered a professional smile before glancing at Ethan. "Are you family?" Ethan straightened slightly. "No, just a friend." Ranger, picking up the tension, shifted his weight but remained still. Marion sat down, flipping through papers. "The hospital's charity board will likely cover most of the costs for now, but you'll need follow-up care. Do you have a place to stay?" Sarah hesitated, her expression tightening. "My apartment. It's across town, but the landlord already said he can't hold it past this week. I can't work yet, and—" Her voice trailed off, shame creeping in. Ethan could see the weight settling back onto her shoulders, the kind of burden that didn't come from childbirth, but from years of surviving on too little. "I'll help her," Ethan said suddenly. The words surprised even him. Marion looked up, eyebrows raised. "You?" He nodded. She can stay at my place until she's back on her feet. I've got space, and Ranger's already decided she's family. Sarah blinked, caught between gratitude and pride. Ethan, I can't let you. You're not letting me do anything, he interrupted gently. I'm offering. Marion studied him for a long moment, then nodded. If that's the case, I'll note you as temporary support contact. You're sure about this? Absolutely. After she left, silence filled the room again, but it was a different kind of quiet, one filled with relief. Sarah looked at him, eyes glistening. Why are you doing all this? Ethan leaned back in the chair, hands clasped loosely. Because once, someone stopped for me when they didn't have to. It saved my life. Maybe this is just how I return the favor. Outside, the light dimmed as evening came. The snow had turned to soft flakes drifting lazily past the window. Sarah watched her baby sleeping and whispered, I think I'll name him Luke. It means light. Feels right after last night. Ethan smiled. Luke Miller, strong name. Ranger stretched and rested his head on Ethan's boot, sighing deeply. Sarah reached out to pet him. He's something else. Ethan chuckled. Yeah, been through fire and storm with me. He doesn't quit on anyone. As the room grew darker, a nurse came in to turn off the overhead light. Sarah's breathing slowed as she drifted toward sleep. Ethan stood, pulling the blanket higher around her. Ranger rose too, circling once before lying near the crib, his eyes half closed but alert, guarding the tiny life beside him. Ethan watched them both, the woman he barely knew and the child who'd been born into a night of chaos, and felt something stir in his chest. Not duty, not pity, something deeper. A quiet pull toward life, toward connection, toward warmth he hadn't believed in for years. Outside, the snow finally stopped. The world was still. Ethan placed a hand on Ranger's back, whispering, We're staying, buddy, just a little longer. And in the stillness of that winter evening, it was clear that the road to light didn't always begin with sunlight. Sometimes it began with a man, a woman, a child, and a loyal dog who refused to walk away. The next morning dawned clear but bitterly cold. The storm had finally broken, leaving Denver bathed in fragile sunlight that glinted across the snow like shards of glass. The hospital halls were calmer now, filled with the soft hum of routine. Ethan Cole stood at the window of Sarah Miller's recovery room, watching the city slowly return to motion. Snowplows clearing the roads, people bundled in coats, life moving forward as if last night's storm had never happened. Inside, the quiet was heavier, more intimate. Sarah slept soundly, her chest rising and falling in gentle rhythm. The baby lay in the small bassinet beside her, wrapped in a pale blue blanket, his face pink and peaceful. Ranger, ever faithful, sat close by, his head resting on his paws, eyes flicking between Ethan and the sleeping mother and child. Ethan turned when the door opened softly. Nurse Lydia entered, holding a tray with warm oatmeal and a glass of water. Her blonde hair was tucked neatly under her cap, though a few strands had escaped and caught the morning light. She smiled when she saw Ranger. "You two still here?" she asked softly. Ethan gave a faint grin. Wouldn't know where else to be. Lydia set the tray down and glanced at Sarah. "She'll be discharged later today. Dr. Henderson said she's recovering faster than expected. Strong woman." Ethan nodded, his gaze lingering on Sarah's face. "Yeah, stronger than most soldiers I've known." Lydia's eyes softened. "You know, she told me she didn't think anyone would stop for her. Said she was ready to give up before you came along." Ethan didn't reply immediately. His hands were in his jacket pockets, and for a moment, his face hardened. That familiar marine stillness. "I almost didn't," he said finally. "Old habits die hard. Keep moving, stay focused, don't get involved." He looked at Ranger, but he didn't give me a choice. Lydia followed his gaze and smiled. Maybe that's why they call them service dogs. Sometimes they serve our hearts more than our orders. Before she left, Lydia added, "There's someone from administration who'd like to speak with you about the payments." Ethan exhaled, already guessing what it was. He wasn't a rich man. His military pension barely covered rent. But something about Sarah's eyes last night, the way she clung to hope even in despair, made him reach for his wallet without hesitation. A few minutes later, Mr. Harvey Grant, the hospital's financial officer, stepped in. He was a stout man in his late 40s with slicked back hair, a neatly trimmed beard, and a habit of smoothing his tie whenever he spoke. His tone was courteous but practiced, the kind of politeness that came from dealing with both gratitude and complaints daily. "Mr. Cole," he said, offering a hand. "I understand you covered Ms. Miller's medical expenses. Quite a substantial amount." Ethan shook his hand firmly. "Yes, that's correct." Harvey smiled faintly, though there was calculation behind his eyes. "Not many people would do that for a stranger. You must be quite the good Samaritan." Ethan's expression didn't change. "Just paying forward what I owe the world." Harvey nodded, jotting something on his clipboard. "Well, the payment cleared. If you ever need documentation for tax purposes—" Ethan cut him off gently. "I don't need paperwork to make it matter." Harvey's rehearsed smile faltered for a second before he excused himself. When Sarah woke a short while later, sunlight fell across her face like a soft halo. She blinked, disoriented, before focusing on Ethan. "You stayed," she murmured, her voice still hoarse. Ethan sat beside the bed. "Told you we would." She reached toward Ranger, who moved closer, resting his chin on her hand. "He's the gentle one, isn't he?" she whispered. Ethan chuckled. "Gentle until he's not. He's been my shadow since the Corps." Sarah smiled faintly. "He's beautiful. Brave, too." The baby stirred, letting out a small sound, and Sarah looked down, her expression melting into tenderness. Ethan watched silently, an unfamiliar ache stirring in his chest. The kind of ache that wasn't pain, but remembrance of something good, something he hadn't felt in years. Around noon, Dr. Henderson entered. His white coat swayed slightly as he walked, the fatigue of decades etched into his features but tempered by quiet pride. "Well, Ms. Miller, you've done splendidly," he said warmly. "Your boy is healthy, and you're recovering faster than most. That's the kind of resilience I like to see." Sarah smiled weakly. "Thank you, Doctor. I owe you everything." Henderson shook his head. "You owe your strength and a bit of luck. The rest, well, I suspect you've got these two to thank." He nodded at Ethan and Ranger. After the doctor left, Sarah turned to Ethan. "I can't ever repay you." Ethan leaned back in the chair. "I'm not asking you to. I didn't do it expecting anything." She bit her lip. "Still, you saved 2 lives. You could have kept driving." He met her gaze, steady and unflinching. "Maybe. But I'd have spent the rest of my life wondering if you made it. I've done enough of that already." Her brow furrowed slightly. "What do you mean?" Ethan hesitated. He rarely talked about the war. The noise, the dust, the smell of cordite, it all lived behind a locked door in his mind. "There was a mission," he began slowly. "Helmand Province. My unit got ambushed. We lost 3 men, 2 dogs. Ranger and I barely made it out. I told myself if I ever had the chance to keep someone from being left behind again, I wouldn't hesitate. His voice dropped to a whisper. I didn't. Sarah said nothing. Her eyes shimmered, not from pity but understanding. The silent bond between two people who had both carried too much, alone. Ranger, sensing the heaviness, nudged Ethan's knee, grounding him back in the present. By late afternoon, the discharge papers were ready. Lydia returned with a warm coat for Sarah and a small knitted cap for the baby. Don't let the wind catch him, she said kindly. Denver winters don't forgive easily. Sarah laughed softly, adjusting the cap on her son's tiny head. I'll remember that. Ethan helped her gather her few belongings, a worn purse, an old phone with a cracked screen, and a faded picture of a younger Sarah with her mother. As they walked toward the exit, the automatic doors opened with a rush of cold air. Sarah stopped, clutching the baby close. I don't even know how to thank you. Ethan looked down at Ranger. You already did. You both made it. Outside, the city gleamed beneath the pale sun. Ranger trotted ahead, tail wagging, leaving clear tracks in the fresh snow. Sarah followed slowly, her coat billowing, her face half hidden by the hood. The baby slept soundly against her chest. Ethan walked beside her, silent but steady, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like a man running from his past. He felt like someone walking towards something, uncertain but alive. The quiet between them wasn't empty. It was the kind of quiet that felt like the start of healing. And as Ranger turned his head to glance back at them, his breath clouding in the cold, Ethan realized that sometimes the bravest heroes were the ones who never needed to be seen. The soldier, the mother, and the loyal dog who simply chose to stay. 1 year had passed since the night of the blizzard. Denver still wore its cloak of snow, but the cold no longer felt cruel. The city had softened under the rhythm of ordinary days. Chimneys smoking, dogs barking in distant yards, and the faint scent of pine drifting through the crisp air. Out in the quiet suburbs, a small wooden house sat at the edge of a frozen lake, its windows glowing with the golden hue of a fireplace. Inside, laughter filled the rooms like warmth made visible. Sarah Miller stood by the kitchen window, stirring a pot of soup on the stove. Her hair, once tangled and tired, now shone in chestnut waves that brushed her shoulders. The hollowness in her cheeks had vanished, replaced by the gentle glow of contentment. She wore a soft gray sweater that clung to her slender frame and jeans faded at the knees. Simple clothes for a woman who had found peace after years of struggle. Her eyes, still the same deep hazel, watched through the frosted glass as Ethan Cole and Ranger played outside in the snow with her son, Luke. Ethan had changed, too. The hard edges in his face had eased. The deep lines around his eyes now softened each time he smiled. He was 31 now, his once cropped hair slightly longer, swept to the side, and a short beard lined his jaw, giving him the rugged air of a man who had earned his quiet life. He was laughing, something Sarah had rarely seen in those early days. His heavy boots crunched in the snow as he knelt to help Luke build a snow fort, his breath steaming in the cold air. Luke, a sturdy 1-year-old with a mop of light brown hair and curious green eyes, clapped his mittened hands as Ranger trotted around him in circles. The dog was older now, gray beginning to touch the black fur around his muzzle, but he still moved with the proud strength of a soldier. Ranger's eyes remained alert, amber and sharp, though there was an unmistakable gentleness in the way he lowered his head for Luke to touch. The boy leaned against him to steady his small frame, giggling as Ranger barked once, softly, like a big brother telling him he'd done well. Sarah's lips curved into a smile as she wiped her hands on a towel. Behind her, the living room was scattered with signs of the life they'd built. A baby blanket draped over the couch, a pair of men's boots by the door, and above the fireplace, a framed photograph. Ethan, Sarah, Luke, and Ranger standing together in the snow, captured mid-laughter. The door opened, and the rush of cold air carried the scent of frost and pine into the house. Ethan stepped inside, cheeks flushed red from the cold, carrying Luke in one arm, while Ranger shook off snow near the door, tail wagging proudly. "I think he's ready for the Marines," Ethan said, grinning. Sarah turned, pretending to scold. "He's won. You're not turning my son into a soldier yet." Ethan laughed, his voice low and warm. "All right, maybe next year." Luke reached for his mother, babbling a mix of sounds that barely resembled words. Sarah took him gently, pressing her lips to his forehead. "You're freezing," she murmured, wrapping him in a blanket. Ethan took off his jacket and boots, glancing toward the fire. "Ranger's been teaching him how to sneak up on me. I swear that dog's still in training mode." Ranger let out a quiet huff, lying by the hearth, his eyes half closed as if smug about the accusation. As they ate dinner together, the house glowed with warmth. The crackle of firewood, the soft clink of spoons, and Luke's occasional squeal when Ranger nudged his tiny feet under the table. The air smelled of rosemary and bread, comfort and belonging. Sarah looked at Ethan across the table. "You know," she said quietly, "sometimes I still think about that night." Ethan leaned back, his gaze steady but calm. "The storm?" She nodded. "Everything changed because you stopped." He smiled faintly. "No," he said, eyes drifting to Ranger, who looked up at the sound of his name. "He saw it first. I just followed his lead." Ranger wagged his tail slowly, almost in agreement. Sarah laughed softly, tears glimmering in her eyes. "Well, then I owe him everything." After dinner, Ethan carried Luke to the nursery. The room was painted a soft blue, filled with toys and tiny shelves of storybooks. Ethan laid the boy in his crib, humming a tune under his breath. An old Marine cadence softened into a lullaby. Ranger sat by the door, ears perked, guarding the threshold as he always did. When Luke's breathing steadied, Ethan turned off the light, leaving only the dim glow of a night lamp shaped like a star. Later, Ethan and Sarah sat on the porch wrapped in blankets, mugs of coffee steaming in their hands. The night stretched quiet around them, the lake frozen under the moonlight. Sarah pulled her sweater tighter, her breath visible in the cold. "You ever miss it?" she asked softly. "The service, the missions, the noise?" Ethan took a slow sip before answering. "Sometimes. Mostly I miss the people, the purpose." He looked toward the horizon where the mountains cut dark shapes against the sky. "But I've found something better now, something worth protecting that doesn't require a uniform." Sarah leaned her head on his shoulder. "We would have never met if you hadn't stopped that night." Ethan chuckled. "If I hadn't listened to Ranger." He scratched the dog's head affectionately. Ranger gave a soft bark, leaning against Ethan's leg, his eyes reflecting the firelight from inside the house. They sat there for a long time, watching the world frozen in stillness. Somewhere far off, a coyote howled, and Ranger's ears twitched, though he didn't move. Sarah whispered, "Do you ever wonder why it was us? Out of everyone you could have passed that night." Ethan's gaze lingered on the snow-covered road in the distance. Maybe it wasn't chance. He said quietly. Maybe that storm didn't come to destroy. Maybe it came to lead us here. Ranger looked up at him then, as if understanding every word. Ethan smiled down at the dog. You were right that night, he said softly. You saw what I couldn't. The wind rose slightly, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke and pine. Sarah reached for Ethan's hand under the blanket, and for a long moment, they simply watched the snow drift down again. Not harsh and relentless like before, but slow, tender, almost forgiving. Ethan exhaled, his voice barely above a whisper. I used to think war took everything from me, but maybe it was just clearing space for this. Ranger rested his head on Ethan's knee, and Sarah smiled through tears. In that moment, with the snow falling softly over Denver, winter didn't feel like an ending anymore. It felt like mercy. Sometimes miracles don't come in thunder or bright lights. They come quietly, in falling snow, in the eyes of a loyal dog, or in the heart of someone who chooses kindness in the midst of darkness. Ethan didn't set out to be a hero, but maybe God did. Because sometimes angels don't have wings. They have snow-covered coats and hearts that know how to stop. When winter comes in your life, when things seem cold and hopeless, remember that God is still at work in the smallest things. A helping hand, a sympathetic look, or a decision to stop and love. That's where His light is hiding. If this story resonates with you, share it to spread the word. Leave a comment with a prayer for those in the midst of life's storms, and subscribe to our channel to find more stories of faith, courage, and God's miracles in the most ordinary things. May God bless you and your family, that no matter how fierce the blizzard outside, your heart will always be warm in His arms.